The Ashworth ballroom glittered like a jewel box that late May evening, every surface reflecting the honeyed glow of 1,000 candles housed in crystal chandeliers that threw dancing shadows across the silk-papered walls. The air hung thick and warm despite the open terrace doors, perfumed with the heady sweetness of hothouse roses arranged in towering urns, mingling with the musk of expensive perfumes and the faint acrid tang of candle wax. Music swelled from the orchestra positioned in the gallery above, a lilting waltz that seemed to pulse with the very heartbeat of the season, while beneath it ran the constant murmur of conversation, punctuated by laughter that tinkled like champagne glasses, by the rustle of silk and satin as ladies swept past in their elaborate gowns, their jewels catching light with every turn. Miss Eleanor Hartley stood at the edge of this glittering assembly, a quiet figure in ivory silk that had been fashioned 2 seasons prior and carefully altered to suit current modes, the modest trim of seed pearls at her neckline pale against the opulent displays surrounding her, the emeralds dripping from Lady Ashworth's throat, the sapphires winking at the Duchess of Waverley's ears, and diamonds that seemed to armor every matron of consequence. She kept her gloved hands folded before her, fingers laced together to prevent any fidgeting that might betray the anxiety coiled tight beneath her carefully composed exterior, and that persistent flutter in her chest that had become her constant companion these past weeks. Beside her stood Lady Pemberton, her sponsor for this critical season, a woman of perhaps 50 years, whose handsome features had settled into lines of perpetual dissatisfaction, whose ice-blue gown matched the temperature of her regard as she surveyed the room with the calculating eye of a general assessing a battlefield. Eleanor could feel that coldness radiating from her benefactress like winter fog, could sense the weight of Lady Pemberton's awareness of every glance directed their way, every whisper that might concern the charity case she had so magnanimously taken under her wing. Asterisk, I am grateful, asterisk, Eleanor reminded herself. The words, a familiar litany she repeated like a prayer. Asterisk, I am grateful for this opportunity, for this chance, for the roof she has provided, and the introduction to society that might secure my future. Asterisk. Yet gratitude felt like a stone she must carry, heavy and unyielding, its weight growing with each passing hour in Lady Pemberton's household. The music swelled louder, and somewhere in the crowd a lady laughed with unrestrained delight, the sound carrying across the ballroom like a bell, and Eleanor found herself wondering what such freedom felt like to laugh without calculation, to move through this glittering world as though one belonged rather than as though one were perpetually on trial. Lady Pemberton leaned closer, her fan snapping open with a decisive crack, and murmured without looking at Eleanor, "The Duke of Greystone is expected this evening. Do endeavour not to embarrass me should he deign to notice our presence." The words settled over Eleanor like frost, and she straightened her spine, lifting her chin slightly as she watched the dancers whirl past, their faces blurred with movement and candlelight, each couple secure in their place, their position, their certainty of belonging. 3 years had passed since Eleanor had last stood in a ballroom as someone who truly belonged. 3 years since the fever had swept through Hartley Manor like a cruel wind, taking first her mother and then, within a fortnight, her father, leaving Eleanor at 19 to discover that the estate she had loved, the rose gardens, where her mother had taught her the names of every bloom, and the library where her father had discussed philosophy and agriculture with equal passion, the tenant cottages she had visited with baskets of provisions, all of it had been mortgaged beyond redemption, the debts accumulating silently while her father's health had failed and his attention to business matters had wavered. The solicitors had been sympathetic but firm. There was nothing to be salvaged, no inheritance beyond her mother's modest jewelry and a small trunk of personal belongings. The distant cousins who inherited what remained of the entailed property had been coldly courteous, offering her a month's hospitality before making clear that more permanent arrangements must be sought elsewhere. Those first years had been a blur of positions companion to a demanding widow in Bath, governess to ungovernable children in Yorkshire, each role chipping away at the sense of self she had carried from her childhood, each dismissal or departure leaving her more adrift, more aware of how thoroughly she had fallen from the sphere in which she had been raised. Lady Pemberton's offer, extended through a distant connection and presented as magnanimous charity, had seemed like salvation, a season in London, a chance to secure a respectable marriage, the possibility of stability, and perhaps even a measure of happiness. Eleanor had accepted with profound gratitude, had endured the pointed reminders of her dependence, the casual cruelties disguised as guidance, the way Lady Pemberton displayed her charity case like a testament to her own virtue, while ensuring Eleanor understood precisely how precarious her position remained. Asterisk, I must be grateful. Asterisk, Eleanor told herself each morning as she dressed in gowns Lady Pemberton deemed acceptable. Each evening, as she smiled through social events where she was introduced as "My dear Miss Hartley, whom I have taken under my wing in her unfortunate circumstances." Her hopes for this season were modest, carefully contained within the boundaries of realism, perhaps a respectable gentleman of moderate fortune, someone kind enough not to hold her poverty against her, someone who might offer her a home, children, a place in the world that was hers by right rather than sufferance. She did not dream of passion or grand romance. She dreamed of security, of never again feeling the cold terror of having nowhere to go, no one to claim her. She dreamed of being wanted rather than tolerated, of building something solid and real from the ruins of what she had lost. Yet even these modest dreams felt fragile as spun glass, threatened by every sharp word from Lady Pemberton, every reminder that her position here was conditional, revocable, dependent entirely upon her benefactress's continued willingness to claim her. And Eleanor carried this knowledge like a weight pressing against her chest, making every breath in this glittering ballroom feel slightly too shallow, every smile slightly too practiced, every moment shadowed by the awareness that she walked a knife's edge between redemption and ruin. The Duke of Greystone's arrival was not announced, required no announcement, for his presence created its own disturbance in the atmosphere of the ballroom, a subtle shift that rippled outward from the entrance like stone dropped into still water, conversations faltering mid-sentence, heads turning with the magnetic pull of rank and consequence made manifest. Eleanor sensed the change before she saw its source, felt it in the way Lady Pemberton's spine straightened as though pulled by invisible strings, in the sudden sharpening of attention among the surrounding guests, in the way the very air seemed to thicken with anticipation. And then she saw him, Alexander Whitmore, Duke of Greystone, pausing at the top of the shallow steps that led down into the ballroom proper, his tall frame silhouetted against the light from the entrance hall, dark evening clothes immaculate and severe against the colorful plumage of the other gentlemen, his bearing carrying that particular quality of command that came not from arrogance, but from the absolute certainty of his position in the world's hierarchy. He was perhaps 30 years of age, dark-haired and clean-shaven in an era when many men favored elaborate whiskers, his features composed in an expression of such perfect reserve that it bordered on coldness, the aristocratic planes of his face revealing nothing of his thoughts as his gaze swept across the assembly with the detached assessment of a man surveying a landscape rather than a social gathering. Eleanor watched as Lady Ashworth hastened forward to greet him, as Lord Ashworth appeared at his hostess's side, as a small crowd of consequence formed around him with the instinctive clustering that power always inspired. Yet the Duke's responses appeared measured and brief, his acknowledgments courteous but without warmth, his attention already moving past those who sought it as though he were performing an obligation rather than seeking enjoyment. She had heard of him. Of course, everyone had heard of the Duke of Greystone, whose vast holdings spread across 3 counties, whose voice in Parliament carried weight on matters of reform and agricultural policy, whose selectiveness in social participation made his attendance at any event noteworthy, whose complete lack of romantic entanglement, despite his eligibility, made him the subject of endless speculation and hopeful maternal scheming. He was said to be cold, exacting, impossible to please, dedicated to his duties with a seriousness that left no room for frivolity, the sort of man who viewed society as a necessary evil to be endured rather than enjoyed. Eleanor observed him as he moved through the room, noting the deference he received, how space opened before him, how conversations paused for his participation, how even the most elevated members of the ton adjusted their positions to accommodate his presence, and felt a sort of abstract curiosity about what it must be like to move through the world with such absolute certainty of one's place, such unquestioned authority. Asterisk, he exists in an entirely different sphere. Asterisk, she thought, watching as he exchanged words with Lord Marchmain. As a determined matron attempted to draw him toward her daughter, only to be politely deflected. Asterisk, as distant from my world as the stars from the earth. and just as untouchable, beside her. Lady Pemberton's fan worked with increased vigor, her calculating gaze following the Duke's progress, and Eleanor recognized that look, the assessment of opportunity, and the consideration of how proximity to such power might be leveraged, and felt a familiar tightening in her chest, knowing that she herself was merely a piece on Lady Pemberton's social chessboard, positioned and moved according to strategies Eleanor could only partially discern, valued only for whatever advantage she might provide to her sponsor's ambitions. The incident began so innocuously that Eleanor would later marvel at how swiftly disaster could bloom from seemingly ordinary seeds. For Mr. Thomas Wellesley was a gentleman she had noticed at previous events, handsome in a dissolute way, his charm carrying an edge that set her instincts humming with warning, his reputation whispered about in retiring rooms as being just slightly beyond respectable, and the sort of man mothers steered their daughters away from, while fathers frowned at his approach. Yet, when he materialized at Lady Pemberton's elbow, requesting an introduction and the honor of Miss Hartley's hand for the next dance, her sponsor's eyes had lit with a calculation Eleanor recognized and dreaded. That particular expression that meant Lady Pemberton saw some advantage in the connection, some social currency to be gained. "Of course, Mr. Wellesley, how delightful," Lady Pemberton said, her smile sharp as cut glass as she all but pushed Eleanor forward, despite the younger woman's hesitation, despite the slight shake of Eleanor's head that went deliberately unnoticed, and Eleanor found herself curtsying to this man, whose gaze traveled over her with an assessment that made her skin crawl, whose smile held something predatory beneath its polished surface. The dance began, a country dance, thank heavens, not a waltz, and for the first few measures all seemed well enough, Wellesley's conversation remaining within bounds of propriety, though his compliments carried undertones that seemed to suggest meanings beyond their surface words, his eyes lingering too long on the modest neckline of her gown, his smile taking on a quality that made Eleanor's stomach tighten with unease. Then his hand, during a turn that brought them close together, settled on her back, just slightly too low, his fingers pressing against her in a manner that could not be mistaken for accident, and when Eleanor shifted away, his hand followed, deliberately maintaining the improper contact as he leaned close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath, and murmured, "You are wasted on this tedious assembly, Miss Hartley. A woman of your particular circumstances must find such events rather limiting in their possibilities." The words themselves, seemingly innocent, but laden with implication that made her pulse spike with alarm. Eleanor maintained her composure through sheer force of will, her smile fixed as she executed the steps of the dance, while her mind raced through possible responses, possible escapes, acutely aware of the eyes upon them, for they were being watched. She could feel the weight of observation, could sense the attention of guests noting every interaction, every gesture, and when the dance finally, mercifully ended, she curtsied with rigid formality and turned to leave only to find Wellesley's hand on her elbow, his grip just firm enough to prevent easy extraction as he steered her toward the terrace doors, away from the crowd, his voice low and insistent as he spoke of the moonlight, of fresh air, of private conversation, his words a thinly veiled proposition that grew more explicit with each passing moment, suggestions of what a woman in her position might accept, what arrangements might be made, how he could be very generous to a lady who understood the nature of mutual benefit. And Eleanor felt ice flood her veins as she understood precisely what he was offering, what he believed her poverty and dependence made her available for, the casual cruelty of his assumption that she could be purchased like any other commodity. Eleanor wrenched her arm from Wellesley's grasp with a force born of desperation and fury combined, her voice emerging steady and cold, despite the trembling that threatened to overtake her entire frame as she said, "You presume too much, Mr. Wellesley, and you mistake my circumstances entirely if you believe poverty has made me amenable to the sort of arrangement you suggest." Each word carefully enunciated, her spine straightening with the dignity her parents had instilled in her, the knowledge that whatever she had lost in fortune she retained in character, and for a moment she saw surprise flash across his florid features, before it transformed into something uglier, darker, the wounded pride of a man unaccustomed to refusal, particularly from a woman he deemed beneath him, and therefore available for his use. His expression twisted, the veneer of charm cracking to reveal the cruelty beneath, and then, horrifyingly, Deliberately, he raised his voice just enough to carry to the nearby guests who lingered near the terrace entrance. His words pitched to reach curious ears as he said, "Come now, Miss Hartley. There is no need for such theatrics. Not after you were so very encouraging during our dance, so very warm in your reception of my attentions." And Eleanor felt her blood turn to ice in her veins as she understood what he was doing, the calculated destruction he was unleashing. For in this world a woman's reputation was everything, and once tarnished could never be restored, and his implications were clear. His suggestion that she had invited his advances, that her refusal now was mere performance after she had already compromised herself. The whispers began immediately, that terrible rustling sound like wind through dead leaves, conversations pausing mid-word as heads turned toward them, as fans were raised to conceal moving lips while eyes remained fixed on the unfolding scene, and Wellesley continued with vicious precision, his voice carrying that tone of wounded masculine dignity as he added, "I had thought a woman in your position, dependent on charity, trading on Lady Pemberton's good name, would be more practical in her understanding of how the world operates. But I see you prefer to play the virtuous maiden even when—" And Eleanor could not bear to hear what he would say next, could not endure the completion of that sentence. So she interrupted with a voice that shook despite her best efforts. "You are mistaken, sir, entirely and completely mistaken, and I must ask you to leave me alone immediately." But the damage was done, irreversible and total, for she could see it in the faces turning away from her, in the way Lady Marchmain gathered her daughter close, as though Eleanor carried some contagion, in the cold assessment, in the eyes of matrons, who moments before had been cordial, if not warm. The music seemed to fade though the orchestra played on, the glittering ballroom taking on the quality of a nightmare where all the beautiful surfaces concealed, traps and pitfalls, where the ground itself was uncertain beneath her feet, and Eleanor watched with a horror that bordered on paralysis as her social death took shape before her eyes, as guests she had danced with earlier now averted their gazes, as young ladies she had conversed with in retiring rooms now whispered behind their fans with expressions of scandalized delight. For nothing entertained society quite so thoroughly as the destruction of one of its more vulnerable members, the confirmation that those who climbed too high from insufficient foundations would inevitably fall, and fall publicly, fall completely, fall without hope of redemption or recovery. Eleanor turned toward Lady Pemberton with a desperation she could no longer conceal, her eyes seeking her sponsor's face across the small distance that separated them, searching for some sign of support, some indication that the woman who had brought her into society would now defend her against these vicious accusations, would speak the truth that Eleanor had done nothing to encourage Wellesley's advances, and that she was the victim rather than the instigator of this terrible scene. But what Eleanor found in Lady Pemberton's expression froze the plea on her lips, for her sponsor's face had transformed into a mask of cold calculation, her eyes assessing Eleanor with the detachment one might apply to a broken piece of furniture, something that had outlived its usefulness and now presented only inconvenience and potential embarrassment. And Eleanor understood in that moment of devastating clarity that no help would come from this quarter, that Lady Pemberton had already made her decision, had already chosen which side of this disaster would best serve her own interests. Lady Pemberton drew herself up with an expression of affronted dignity, her voice pitched to carry to the assembled guests who had fallen silent around them, their avid attention fixed on this unfolding drama as she said, "I find myself in the unfortunate position of having to acknowledge that I have had concerns about Miss Hartley's character for some time now," each word falling like a stone into still water, creating ripples of shock and vindicated suspicion across the watching faces, and Eleanor felt something break inside her chest, some last fragile hope shattering beyond repair as her sponsor continued. "I took her in out of charity, out of respect for her late father's memory, but I begin to see that my generosity was misplaced, that I failed to recognize certain unfortunate tendencies, a certain want of proper feeling that poverty and misfortune have perhaps engendered." The words carefully chosen to suggest everything, while stating nothing directly actionable, paint Eleanor as corrupted by her reduced circumstances, as someone who had taken advantage of Lady Pemberton's good nature and repaid it with scandal and impropriety. The watching guests murmured their sympathy for Lady Pemberton's position, their expressions conveying that they had suspected something of this nature all along, that girls without fortune or family were always risks, always liable to drag down those who tried to help them. And Eleanor stood frozen as her sponsor delivered the final, killing blow. I must therefore withdraw my sponsorship of Miss Hartley, effective immediately, and state clearly that she is no longer under my protection or residing in my household. I cannot and will not allow my reputation to be compromised by association with a young woman whose conduct has proven so questionable. And, with those words, Eleanor lost not merely her social standing but her actual home, the roof over her head, the fragile security that had been her only shield against complete destitution, for she had been living in Lady Pemberton's London house, dependent on her sponsor's continued favour. And now that favour was withdrawn publicly, irrevocably, leaving Eleanor with nowhere to go, no one to turn to, her situation transformed in mere moments from precarious to impossible. Eleanor's hands began to tremble uncontrollably, a tremor that started in her fingers and spread through her entire body. Despite her desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of composure, her breath coming shallow and quick as the full magnitude of her catastrophe settled over her like a suffocating weight. For she was ruined now in every sense that mattered, her reputation destroyed, her home gone, her few possessions still in Lady Pemberton's house, where she would likely never be permitted to retrieve them, her modest quarterly allowance from her father's depleted estate, insufficient to secure lodgings or survival without references or reputation to support her, and no respectable household would employ a woman tainted by scandal. No family would accept her as governess or companion when whispers of impropriety followed her name, and she could feel the walls of her world closing in, the future narrowing to a dark point of impossible choices and unthinkable outcomes that her mind shied away from contemplating. Eleanor stood alone in the center of the crowded ballroom, and yet she had never felt such complete isolation, for the glittering assembly had transformed into something hostile and alien. The guests who moments before had filled the space with animated conversation, now turning their backs to her with deliberate precision, a choreographed rejection more cutting than any words could be, and she watched as women she had curtsied to, men she had danced with, matrons she had served tea beside in drawing rooms, all shifted their positions to exclude her from their circles, to demonstrate through bodily arrangement that she no longer existed in their world, that she had been erased from the social fabric as thoroughly as if she had never been woven into it at all. Lady Ashworth, the evening's hostess, approached with a smile that did not reach her eyes, her face arranged in an expression of tight-lipped courtesy that barely concealed the annoyance beneath, and she said in a voice of exquisite politeness, "Miss Hartley, perhaps you might be more comfortable retiring for the evening. I'm certain this has all been terribly distressing for you, and I would not wish you to endure further discomfort." The words kind on their surface but unmistakable in their true meaning. A dismissal couched in concern, a command dressed as consideration, for Eleanor's continued presence was an embarrassment, a blight on the evening's festivities, and her removal would allow the assembled guests to return to their pleasure without the uncomfortable reminder of scandal and ruin standing visible in their midst. Eleanor felt something collapse inside her chest, some internal structure that had been holding her upright suddenly giving way, and yet her external composure remained intact through sheer force of will, through the training her mother had instilled in her since childhood, that a gentlewoman maintains her dignity, regardless of circumstance, regardless of pain, regardless of the crumbling of her entire world. And so she inclined her head to Lady Ashworth with perfect courtesy and murmured, "You are most kind. I shall take my leave." Her voice steady despite the roaring in her ears, despite the calculation already spinning through her mind of what came next, of where she could possibly go when she had no home to return to. When Lady Pemberton's house was closed to her, when she possessed perhaps £20 to her name, and no references for employment, and a reputation now so thoroughly destroyed that no respectable household would accept her, and the future narrowed before her into a dark tunnel of impossible choices, of outcomes, her mind recoiled from contemplating, even as the practical part of her consciousness forced her to acknowledge that she would need to secure lodgings tonight, somewhere cheap enough for her limited funds, somewhere that would accept a young woman alone without questions she could not answer. She gathered what remained of her courage, drawing it around her like an invisible cloak, and began the long walk toward the ballroom exit. Her steps measured and deliberate, her spine straight and her chin level, giving them nothing more to feed upon. No tears, no visible collapse, no confirmation of the weakness they expected to see. And it was the longest walk of her life, each step taking her past faces that turned away, past conversations that paused and resumed in whispers behind her, past the wreckage of every hope and plan she had harbored, and the distance to the door seemed to expand infinitely, the glittering space becoming a gauntlet of silent judgment, of satisfied cruelty, of the particular pleasure society took in witnessing the fall of those who had dared to rise above their circumstances, who had attempted to claim a place among their betters without the fortune or family to support such presumption. And Eleanor understood that she was being made an example, a cautionary tale that would be repeated in drawing rooms and at dinner tables, the story of the girl who forgot her place and paid the price for her presumption. Eleanor had traversed perhaps half the distance to the ballroom doors, her measured steps carrying her through the gauntlet of turned backs and averted faces, when a figure stepped directly into her path with such sudden authority that she halted abruptly, her breath catching in her throat as she looked up to find herself face to face with the Duke of Greystone, his tall form blocking her way forward, his dark eyes fixed upon her with an intensity that sent a shock of confusion through her already overwhelmed mind. And the murmur of conversation around them died instantly, as every guest in the vicinity turned to witness this unprecedented development, for the Duke was not a man given to impulsive gestures, not a man who inserted himself into social scandals, and yet here he stood before the ruined girl whom everyone had just watched being cast out, and Eleanor felt her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to comprehend what was happening, tried to understand whether this was some new humiliation being prepared, some final twist of the knife that would complete her destruction. The Duke inclined his head with perfect formality, his expression unreadable, his voice carrying clearly through the sudden silence as he said, "Miss Hartley, I believe this is my dance." And Eleanor stared at him in complete bewilderment, for they had never been introduced, had never exchanged so much as a word, and she knew with absolute certainty that her dance card, now crumpled somewhere in her reticule, contained no entry for the Duke of Greystone, could never have contained such an entry, for men of his rank did not dance with penniless orphans of questionable reputation, did not acknowledge girls who existed so far beneath their sphere, and yet he stood before her with his arm extended, waiting, his steady gaze never wavering from her face as the ballroom held its collective breath around them. Eleanor's mind spun with chaotic thoughts. Was this some cruel jest, some final mockery, designed to compound her humiliation by offering false hope before snatching it away? Or had the Duke somehow failed to hear of her disgrace? Was he unaware of what had just transpired and about to be informed by some helpful soul that he was addressing a woman whose reputation lay in ruins at his feet? But even as these fears tumbled through her consciousness, she recognized the impossibility of his ignorance, for the scene had been public, had been witnessed by half the assembled guests, and the Duke was not a man who missed such details, which meant he knew exactly what he was doing, knew that he was offering his arm to a woman society had just rejected, and Eleanor could not fathom why, could not comprehend what motivated this gesture, whether it sprang from pity or some incomprehensible political calculation, or perhaps some obscure obligation to her late father. And in her confusion she hesitated, her hand half raised but not yet touching his arm, for she feared that accepting might somehow make everything worse, might offend him when he realized his mistake, or expose her to even greater humiliation if this proved to be some elaborate cruelty. His eyes remained steady on hers, patient but unwavering, and Eleanor suddenly understood that refusing the Duke of Greystone's offered arm, declining his invitation to dance before the entire assembly, would be a social offense far greater than any scandal Wellesley could manufacture, would mark her not merely as ruined, but as impossibly ill-bred, too ignorant of proper conduct to recognize the honor being extended, regardless of its motive. And so with a hand that trembled visibly, she placed her fingers upon his arm, feeling through her thin glove the solid warmth of him, the strength that seemed to radiate from his mere presence. And as his other hand covered hers briefly in acknowledgement, she felt the tremor that had been threatening to become a full collapse, gradually steady into something more manageable, some fragment of composure borrowed from his unshakable calm. The Duke led Eleanor onto the dance floor with a command in his bearing that brooked no resistance, and the orchestra, which had faltered into uncertain silence during the confrontation, resumed playing as if the conductor had been awaiting precisely this signal, the strains of a waltz filling the vast space with lilting melody that seemed to restore the evening to its proper rhythm, though Eleanor could feel the weight of every eye in the ballroom fixed upon them as the Duke's hand settled at her waist with perfect propriety. And he guided her into the first turn with an assurance that spoke of years of flawless execution, and she found herself moving through the steps automatically, her body responding to his lead, even as her mind remained trapped in a state of numb bewilderment, unable to process the impossible reversal of the past few minutes. His hand was warm through her glove, a solid presence that anchored her when she felt as though she might simply dissolve into the air, and she was acutely conscious of the tremor in her own fingers where they rested on his shoulder, the visible evidence of her distress that she could not quite control despite her desperate attempts to maintain some semblance of composure, for she had endured Lady Pemberton's betrayal and the crowd's rejection with dignity intact. But this unexpected rescue had somehow fractured the defenses she had erected, leaving her vulnerable and shaking in a way that humiliation alone had not achieved. The Duke's expression remained perfectly neutral, his dark eyes focused somewhere past her shoulder as he navigated them through the other dancing couples with effortless grace. But after several measures had passed, he spoke in a voice pitched for her ears alone, low enough that the surrounding dancers could not overhear, saying, "Your father was Sir James Hartley of Hartley Park, was he not?" And the question, so unexpected and so carefully ordinary, gave Eleanor something to focus on beyond the nightmare of the past hour. Beyond the stairs, she could still feel boring into her back, despite the resumed dancing, and she managed to reply with tolerable steadiness, "Yes, Your Grace, did you know him?" The Duke executed a turn that brought them momentarily away from the nearest couple, and he said, "We met on several occasions at sessions of the Agricultural Society. He presented a paper on drainage systems that I found quite innovative, and we corresponded briefly afterward about its implementation on my northern estates." And Eleanor felt something shift in her chest, some small warmth pushing back against the cold terror that had been consuming her. For her father had been so proud of that paper, had worked on it for months before his death, and to hear it referenced now by this powerful man, who had no reason to remember or to mention it, struck her as a kindness more profound than the dance itself. She found herself responding with more animation, describing her father's other work, his theories about crop rotation that he had never lived to fully test, and the Duke listened with what appeared to be genuine interest, asking questions that demonstrated actual knowledge of agricultural practice rather than merely polite attention, and gradually Eleanor felt her trembling begin to subside, her breathing steadying as the conversation gave her troubled mind something concrete to hold, a lifeline of normalcy in the surreal situation, and she realized that this was intentional, that he was deliberately providing her with a means of recovering her composure, offering her the protection not merely of his rank, but of his quiet consideration. And the waltz continued through its graceful patterns, while around them, the ballroom slowly returned to its usual rhythms, conversations resuming, laughter rising again, the scandal that had moments ago threatened to define the entire evening, gradually being absorbed into the background, as the assembly recognized that the Duke of Greystone's intervention had altered the social calculus entirely, that whatever judgment they had been prepared to render on Miss Hartley must now be reconsidered in light of his unprecedented support. The final measures of the waltz approached, and Eleanor felt a new anxiety rising, for when the music ended she would be released back into the crowd that had so recently rejected her, left to face alone whatever came next. But as the last notes faded, and the dancers around them began to separate, the Duke did not immediately release her, his hand remaining at her waist for a heartbeat longer than strict propriety demanded. And when he finally stepped back, his eyes met hers directly for the first time since they had begun dancing, and in their dark depths she saw something she could not quite interpret, some intensity of purpose that sent her heart racing anew, even as she tried to tell herself not to read meaning into gestures that might signify nothing more than aristocratic duty. The Duke maintained his position before Eleanor for a long moment, his dark eyes still holding hers with that unfathomable intensity, and then quite deliberately he turned to face the assembled guests, who had drawn closer during the waltz, their faces alight with curiosity and calculation as they attempted to divine the meaning of what they had witnessed. And in the sudden hush that fell across that portion of the ballroom, the Duke's voice rang out with crystalline clarity, pitched to carry to every corner of the vast space, as he said, "I trust the assembly will forgive my interruption of the evening's festivities, but I find I cannot in good conscience allow falsehood to stand unchallenged when it impugns the character of a woman I know to be entirely blameless." And Eleanor felt the blood drain from her face as she realized he was about to make some form of public statement, that whatever protection he had offered through the dance was about to be either confirmed or revealed as temporary courtesy. And she stood frozen beside him, as every eye in the ballroom fixed upon them with avid attention, the musicians falling silent mid-phrase, as even they recognized that something unprecedented was unfolding. The Duke continued with perfect composure, his tone formal but carrying an edge of steel that Eleanor had not heard during their dance, saying, "Miss Eleanor Hartley is a woman of unimpeachable character and irreproachable conduct, and any suggestion to the contrary is not merely mistaken but deliberately malicious." And he paused, allowing his words to settle over the crowd like a mantle of authority, before adding, "I personally guarantee her reputation and good name, and I will consider any slander against her to be a direct insult to my own honor, to be answered as such insults have always been answered among gentlemen." And the threat implicit in that final phrase sent a visible ripple through the assembled guests, for everyone present understood that the Duke of Greystone was a man whose challenges could not be ignored, whose rank and power made opposition not merely socially dangerous but potentially ruinous, and Eleanor watched in numb astonishment as the social calculus that had condemned her mere minutes ago reversed itself entirely under the weight of his protection. The Duke was not finished, however, and he turned slightly to include Eleanor in his address as he said, "Furthermore, I have this evening dispatched a message to my sister, the Duchess of Rothwell, requesting that she call upon Miss Hartley tomorrow at her earliest convenience, as I believe the two ladies will find much common ground in their interests and conversation." And this announcement, being so casual in its delivery, yet so momentous in its implications, struck the assembly with the force of a physical blow, for an invitation to the intimate acquaintance of the Duchess of Rothwell was among the most coveted prizes of the social season, a mark of favor that opened doors throughout the highest echelons of society, and to extend such an invitation publicly, to make it a matter of record before hundreds of witnesses, was to place Miss Hartley under the explicit protection of one of the most powerful families in England, to declare that she was not merely tolerated but actively welcomed into their sphere. Eleanor's mind reeled as she tried to comprehend what was happening, why this man, whom she had never met before this evening, would not only defend her but elevate her with such deliberate and irrevocable gestures, and she found herself swaying slightly on her feet as the shock of the past hour, the humiliation, the terror, the despair, and now this impossible rescue finally overwhelmed the composure she had been desperately maintaining. But the Duke's hand moved almost imperceptibly to steady her elbow, and the touch so brief and subtle that no one else would have remarked it. Yet it was enough to anchor her as the ballroom erupted into a cacophony of whispered conversations and barely concealed speculation. Across the room, Eleanor caught sight of Lady Pemberton's face, pale as milk and tight with trapped fury. For the widow could not possibly contradict the Duke's declaration without making an enemy of a man whose displeasure could destroy what remained of her own social standing. And beside her, Mr. Wellesley had disappeared entirely, having apparently recognized the wisdom of removing himself from the vicinity before the Duke's attention turned specifically in his direction. And Eleanor felt a savage satisfaction pierce through her bewilderment as she watched her tormentors, trapped by the very social mechanisms they had attempted to use against her, now turned back upon them with devastating force by a man whose authority none present could challenge. The transformation that swept through the ballroom in the wake of the Duke's declaration was like watching the tide reverse its course, the same guests who had turned their backs on Eleanor mere minutes ago now approaching with expressions of cautious courtesy, their faces carefully arranged into masks of polite interest, as though they had never participated in her near destruction, and Eleanor found herself suddenly surrounded by a press of bodies, by inquiries after her health and comfort, by offers of refreshment and seating, by 100 small gestures of consideration that would have seemed absurd had they not been so desperately necessary to these people's social survival. for none could afford to be seen standing against the Duke of Greystone's explicitly stated will. The Duke himself remained at her side through this bewildering reversal, his hand still resting with perfect propriety at her elbow as he guided her through the suddenly deferential crowd toward a seating area near the windows, where tall panes of glass reflected the candlelight and created the illusion of doubled splendor. And Eleanor moved as though in a dream, her mind unable to fully process the catastrophic reversals of the past hour, the plunge from merely vulnerable to utterly ruined, and now to inexplicably protected by the most powerful man in the room. The Duke procured a chair for her with a gesture that sent two young gentlemen scrambling to provide it, and once she was seated, he acquired refreshments with similar ease, presenting her with a glass of champagne and a plate of delicate confections that she had no capacity to consume but accepted nonetheless, because her hands needed something to hold, something to occupy them, so they would not shake so visibly. And through all of this, the Duke's manner remained perfectly composed, his dark eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts or motivations as he stood beside her chair like a sentinel, his very presence creating a zone of safety that none would dare to breach without his permission. Eleanor's mind churned with questions she could not ask, foremost among them the simple, overwhelming why. Why would a man of his rank and consequence involve himself in her troubles? Why would he not only rescue her, but elevate her with such deliberate and public gestures? What possible interest could he have in the fate of an impoverished gentlewoman whom he had never even met before this evening? She studied his profile as he stood beside her, the strong lines of his jaw, the aristocratic slope of his nose, the dark hair swept back from a broad forehead, searching for some clue to his intentions, but his expression remained as unreadable as carved marble, and she felt a stirring of something that might have been suspicion had she not been so desperately grateful, for in her experience, kindness always came with conditions attached, always demanded some form of payment, and she could not help but wonder what debt she was accruing with every moment of his protection. The approach of Lady Ashworth, their hostess, interrupted her troubled thoughts, and Eleanor looked up to see the woman who had suggested her departure not 20 minutes ago now wearing an expression of warm concern, as she said, "My dear Miss Hartley, I am mortified that such distress should have befallen you under my roof. Please, you must allow me to make amends for the incivility you have suffered." And the complete reversal of the woman's attitude would have been laughable had it not been so clearly calculated, so transparently motivated by fear of the Duke's displeasure rather than any genuine care for Eleanor's well-being. Yet Eleanor found she did not care about the hypocrisy, found that she would accept whatever protection these false courtesies provided, for pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Lady Ashworth continued, her voice taking on a tone of practiced warmth as she said, "I hope you will consent to remain as my guest for the remainder of your time in London. I have several comfortable rooms available, and it would be my honor to provide you hospitality." And Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, uncertain what words could possibly be adequate to this surreal situation. But before she could speak, the Duke's voice cut smoothly across the space, saying, "That is a generous offer, Lady Ashworth, though I believe my sister the Duchess will wish to extend her own invitation once she has made Miss Hartley's acquaintance tomorrow." And the subtle redirection, the quiet assertion of his family's prior claim, sent Lady Ashworth into effusive agreement as she assured them both that, of course, whatever arrangement Miss Hartley preferred would be entirely suitable. And Eleanor watched this exchange with the numb detachment of someone observing events that seemed to be happening to another person entirely, but in another life, far removed from the desperate reality she had inhabited just an hour before. The Duke remained at her side for another quarter hour, his presence ensuring that the protection he had extended remained visible and incontrovertible. And then he leaned down slightly, his voice pitched for her ears alone as he said, "You defended your honor with dignity when you might have crumbled, Miss Hartley, that deserved recognition." And before she could formulate any response to these quiet words, before she could ask any of the 100 questions clamoring in her mind, he straightened and took his formal leave, bowing over her hand with perfect courtesy before striding away through the crowd that parted before him like water before the prow of a ship. And Eleanor watched him go, with her heart pounding against her ribs, uncertain whether she had just been saved or merely granted a temporary reprieve from a destruction that still awaited her, but knowing that her life had been irrevocably altered by a man whose motives remained as mysterious as they were apparently benevolent, and that whatever came next, she would face it without understanding why fate had chosen this particular moment to offer her a hand up from the abyss. The following morning arrived with a quality of unreality that made Eleanor question whether the events of the previous evening had truly occurred, or whether she had conjured them from some fever dream born of desperation. But when Lady Ashworth's maid brought her breakfast in the comfortable guest room, where she had spent a sleepless night, the woman's deferential manner and the fine quality of the accommodations confirmed that something had indeed shifted in her circumstances, though whether permanently or temporarily remained to be seen, and Eleanor found herself unable to eat more than a few bites of the excellent food provided, as her stomach churned with anxiety about what the day would bring. The Duchess of Rothwell arrived precisely at 11 o'clock, and Eleanor watched from the upstairs window as an elegant carriage bearing a ducal crest pulled up before Lady Ashworth's townhouse, her heart hammering against her ribs as she tried to prepare herself for whatever this interview would entail. For surely the Duke's sister would wish to assess whether Eleanor was worthy of the protection her brother had so inexplicably extended, and Eleanor descended the stairs with trembling hands, smoothing the modest morning dress Lady Ashworth had lent her, since she possessed nothing suitable of her own after Lady Pemberton's eviction. The woman who awaited her in the drawing-room was perhaps 30 years of age, with warm brown eyes and an expression of genuine kindness that immediately distinguished her from the calculating society matrons Eleanor had come to know, and Lady Catherine Sutherland, Duchess of Rothwell, rose from her seat with a smile that reached her eyes as she said, "Miss Hartley, I am so very pleased to make your acquaintance. My brother has spoken most highly of your character and composure," and the casual reference to the Duke having spoken of her at all sent a flush of confusion and something that might have been hope through Eleanor's chest, though she tried to suppress it as dangerous. The Duchess's purpose became clear within the first quarter hour of their conversation, for she extended an invitation for Eleanor to stay at Rothwell House as her guest, not for a few days but for the remainder of the season and beyond if Eleanor wished. And she did so with such natural warmth and lack of condescension that Eleanor found tears pricking at her eyes as she accepted, unable to fully comprehend how her life had pivoted so dramatically from utter ruin to this unexpected refuge in the space of less than a day. The weeks that followed took on a dreamlike quality as Eleanor adjusted to her new circumstances within the elegant confines of Rothwell House, where the Duchess proved to be not merely a generous hostess but a genuine friend, introducing Eleanor to a circle of intelligent, reform-minded women who discussed politics and literature with the same fervor that other ladies devoted to fashion and gossip, and gradually Eleanor felt herself emerging from the shock of what had occurred at the Ashworth ball, her mind beginning to process not just her rescue, but the mysterious nature of it, the question of why the Duke of Greystone had chosen to intervene so decisively in the troubles of a woman he had never met. The Duchess spoke of her brother occasionally, always with evident affection and respect, and through these casual references, Eleanor began to piece together a portrait of a man dedicated to his duties with almost monastic devotion, involved in parliamentary reform efforts, managing vast estates with careful attention to his tenants' welfare, carrying the weight of his family's ancient name and the expectations that came with it, a man who had never shown romantic interest in any of the eligible women who vied for his attention each season, who was rumored to consider marriage a duty he would eventually fulfill, but approached with the same lack of enthusiasm one might reserve for reviewing account books. Eleanor told herself that gratitude was the only appropriate emotion she should feel toward such a man, that the gap between a duke and an impoverished gentlewoman was unbridgeable regardless of his unexpected kindness, and that she must not mistake rescue for anything deeper. Yet she found herself thinking of him at odd moments, remembering the steadiness of his hand as he led her through that waltz, the quiet intensity in his dark eyes, the words he had spoken for her ears alone about dignity, deserving recognition, and she wondered what kind of man possessed both the power to destroy or save with a single declaration and the inclination to use that power in defense of a stranger, and whether she would ever understand the motivations that had prompted him to offer his arm before everyone when the entire world had turned its back. Weeks passed, and Eleanor's life took on a rhythm that felt both surreal and increasingly natural. Her days filled with morning calls and afternoon walks, with musical evenings and quiet hours in the Duchess's library, with the careful reconstruction of a social position that had been so nearly destroyed. And through all of these activities, she found herself encountering the Duke of Greystone, with a frequency that seemed coincidental at first, but gradually revealed itself to be something more deliberate, though she could not determine whether the arrangement stemmed from his design or his sister's, or merely the inevitable overlap of their social circles. At Lady Thornbury's soirée, she saw him across the drawing room, engaged in animated discussion with several members of Parliament about proposed reforms to the poor laws, his usual reserve falling away as he argued his position with an intensity that transformed his austere features. And she found herself watching him with an attention that went beyond mere gratitude, noting the elegant gestures of his hands as he spoke, the flash of passion in his dark eyes, the way he listened as intently as he argued, giving weight to opposing views even when he disagreed with them. At the Duchess of Marlborough's garden party, she observed him from a distance as he politely but firmly extricated himself from the determined attentions of several eligible young ladies, and his manner unfailingly courteous but completely impersonal, and she saw in those careful withdrawals something of what the Duchess had described: a man who performed his social duties with precision but without engagement, as though he stood perpetually at a remove from the glittering world he inhabited by virtue of his birth. When their paths did cross directly at these events, his acknowledgement of her was always proper, always brief, a formal bow, a few words of greeting inquiring after her comfort and her health, perhaps a comment on the weather or the quality of the hostess's entertainment, and then he would move on, leaving her with nothing substantial to analyze and yet everything to wonder about. For there was something in his eyes during those brief exchanges, some quality of attention that felt different from the perfunctory courtesy he extended to others. Though she told herself repeatedly that she was imagining significance where none existed, projecting her own developing feelings onto a man who had merely performed an act of chivalrous rescue and considered his obligation thereby fulfilled. Yet she could not stop herself from watching for him at every event she attended, her eyes searching crowded rooms for his tall figure and dark hair, her heart lifting inexplicably when she spotted him, and she began to notice small things that spoke to aspects of his character, invisible in casual social interaction, the way he always acknowledged the servants who attended these gatherings, treating them with the same courtesy he afforded the highest-ranked guests, the occasions when she caught him suppressing a smile at some piece of social absurdity, the rare moments when his reserve cracked enough to reveal a dry wit that surprised laughs from his conversational partners. At Lord Pemberton's dinner party, an event Eleanor attended with some trepidation, given the connection to her former sponsor, she found herself seated at the opposite end of the table from the Duke, but she noticed how his attention kept drifting from his dinner partners toward the conversation at her end of the table, where she was discussing with an elderly scholar the recent translations of Greek texts, and twice she looked up to find his gaze resting on her, with an expression she could not read, before he quickly returned his attention to the lady beside him. Eleanor's internal conflict grew with each of these encounters, her gratitude toward him remaining constant, but now entangled with something deeper and more dangerous, a fascination that had nothing to do with his rescue of her, and everything to do with the man she was gradually coming to know through these accumulated observations. Yet she remained grimly aware that any hopes she might harbor in his direction were foolish beyond measure, for the gap between a duke and an impoverished gentlewoman remained unbridgeable regardless of his sister's kindness, and surely a man of his consequence must eventually marry someone of appropriate rank and fortune, and someone who could bring political alliance and social advantage rather than merely gratitude and developing affection. And so Eleanor tried to guard her heart, even as she felt it slipping beyond her control, tried to remember that rescue was not courtship and kindness was not love, but found with each passing week that the slow burn of awareness building within her was becoming increasingly impossible to deny or dismiss. The library at Rothwell House had become Eleanor's favorite refuge during the quiet afternoon hours, when the Duchess attended to correspondence or paid calls without requiring Eleanor's accompaniment, and it was there that she had discovered a peace that eluded her in the more public rooms of the house, surrounded by volumes that spanned philosophy and history, poetry and practical sciences, their leather bindings and gilt lettering speaking to generations of accumulated knowledge, and she found herself drawn particularly to the agricultural texts that lined one wall near the tall windows overlooking the garden, their pages filled with discussions of crop rotation and soil management, drainage systems and tenant relations, subjects that reminded her of happier times when her father had walked with her through their estate's fields, explaining the rhythms of planting and harvest, the careful stewardship required to maintain land and care for those who worked it. And though that life was lost to her now, she could still find comfort in reading about the principles that had once governed her world. On a Thursday afternoon in late September, when golden light slanted through the library windows and the air carried the first crisp hint of approaching autumn, Eleanor sat curled in the window seat with a volume titled Modern Innovations in Agricultural Practice open on her lap, so absorbed in a chapter about the Norfolk four-course system that she did not hear the library door open or register another presence in the room until a masculine voice said, with evident surprise, "That is Townsend's treatise. I did not expect to find anyone reading it, least of all." And she looked up with a start to find the Duke of Greystone standing just inside the doorway, his dark eyes fixed on the book in her hands, with an expression that transformed his usually austere features into something approaching wonder, and she felt heat rise in her cheeks as she struggled to her feet, nearly dropping the volume in her haste to offer a proper curtsy. "Your Grace, I apologize. I did not know you were expected. The Duchess did not mention I should not have presumed to use the library without permission. I will remove myself immediately," she managed to say, despite the way her heart had begun hammering at his unexpected appearance. But he raised one hand in a gesture that stopped her words as effectively as if he had placed his fingers against her lips, and he said, "Please, Miss Hartley, you need not apologize for reading, and certainly not for reading Townsend. My sister has extended you full hospitality of the house, which naturally includes the library, and I confess myself merely startled to discover someone sharing my particular interest in agricultural reform, as it is not generally considered suitable drawing-room conversation, particularly among young ladies." He moved further into the room with that controlled grace she had observed during their waltz, and Eleanor found herself acutely conscious of how the afternoon light illuminated the sharp planes of his face, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead as he tilted his head to examine the shelves near where she stood, and she tried to steady her breathing as he selected another volume from the collection and said, "Have you reached the section on turnips and their role in the rotation cycle? Townsend makes a compelling argument for their value, both as fodder and as a means of improving soil fertility, though I believe his estimates of yield are somewhat optimistic based on my own estate's experience." The casual way he invited her opinion, as though her thoughts on agricultural matters held genuine weight, prompted her to reply despite her nervousness. "My father implemented a similar rotation on our estate, his estate rather, before it was sold, and he found that the turnips succeeded admirably in our soil, though he noted that the labor required for their cultivation and harvest exceeded Townsend's projections, which affected the overall economy of the system." And the words emerged more steadily than she had expected, drawn forth by the memory of walking those fields with her father, learning to see the land as he did, and as a living system requiring careful balance and attention. The Duke's expression shifted into something Eleanor could only describe as fascinated attention, and he moved closer, close enough that she could catch the faint scent of sandalwood and leather that clung to him, and he said, "Your father taught you estate management. That is remarkably progressive. Most gentlemen consider such knowledge unsuitable for their daughters, believing it necessary only for sons who will inherit," and there was something in his voice that suggested approval rather than criticism, and Eleanor found herself explaining, "I was his only child, and he believed that understanding the land and those who worked it was essential to being a responsible steward, regardless of gender. And though I could not inherit, he said the knowledge would serve me well in understanding my future husband's concerns, assuming I married a man with property," and she heard the slight bitterness that crept into her final words, the acknowledgement of how thoroughly those assumptions had been destroyed. "Your father was a wise man," the Duke said quietly, and then, with careful deliberation, "and his daughter has clearly inherited both his intelligence and his understanding of duty. Tell me, Miss Hartley, what is your opinion of the enclosure movement and its effects on common farmers? I am currently engaged in parliamentary debates on the subject and find that most discussions lack practical understanding of the human consequences involved." And with that question, he effectively invited her into a conversation that stretched far beyond the polite pleasantries that had characterized their previous brief encounters. and Eleanor felt something shift between them as she offered her thoughts on the displacement of tenant farmers and the loss of common rights, as he responded with his own observations from his estates and his efforts to balance agricultural efficiency with moral obligation, their discussion ranging across crop yields and social responsibility, innovation and tradition, the words flowing with an ease that Eleanor had not experienced since her father's death, an intellectual engagement that fed something in her she had not realized was starving. The afternoon encounter in the library marked a shift in the careful distance that had characterized their previous interactions, and in the days that followed, Eleanor found herself encountering the Duke of Greystone with a frequency that could no longer be attributed to mere coincidence. For he began appearing at the morning rides in Hyde Park that she took with the Duchess, his dark horse falling into step beside their carriage as he inquired about their plans for the day with a casualness that seemed studied, and when the Duchess invited him to join them, he accepted with an alacrity that belied his reputation for avoiding such social pleasantries. Riding alongside Eleanor's side of the carriage and continuing their previous discussion about agricultural improvement, as though no time had passed since they stood together in the library's golden afternoon light. He called at Rothwell House on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, ostensibly to consult with his sister on family matters, but these consultations seemed to conclude with remarkable speed, and he would inevitably find his way to whatever room Eleanor occupied, settling into conversation about whatever book she held or subject she contemplated, their discussions ranging across poetry and philosophy, the role of government in social welfare and the responsibility of privilege, the proper balance between tradition and progress, and Eleanor found in these exchanges an intellectual stimulation she had not experienced since her father's death, a sense of being truly heard and valued for her thoughts rather than merely tolerated. At musical evenings and dinner parties, she would look up from her conversation to find his gaze resting on her from across the room with an intensity that made her breath catch, and he would make his way to her side with an inevitability that set tongues wagging among the assembled guests, always maintaining perfect propriety, always remaining within the bounds of acceptable social interaction, but increasingly, unmistakably present in her life in a way that both thrilled and terrified her. Their conversations deepened with each encounter, moving beyond the intellectual discussions that had first connected them into territory more personal and revealing, and she learned of his isolation within his elevated position, the way his rank created a barrier between himself and genuine connection, his frustration with the shallow social games that consumed so much of his world, and his passionate commitment to using his position and wealth to effect meaningful change in the lives of those dependent on his estates and influence. And she recognized in him a loneliness that mirrored her own, a sense of being fundamentally separated from the glittering world they both inhabited, though for vastly different reasons. Yet even as Eleanor felt her feelings developing beyond gratitude into something deeper and more dangerous, even as she caught herself watching for his arrival at every event and treasuring each word they exchanged, she remained grimly aware that nothing could come of this connection, for the gap between a duke and an impoverished gentlewoman remained unbridgeable, regardless of how many conversations they shared or how his eyes softened when he looked at her, and surely a man of his consequence must eventually marry someone of appropriate rank and fortune, someone who could bring political alliance and substantial dowry rather than merely intellectual companionship, and a heart that was increasingly, helplessly his. As September gave way to October and the leaves in the park turned gold and crimson, as the air grew crisp and the light took on that particular slanted quality of advancing autumn, Eleanor recognized with melancholy certainty that she had fallen in love with a man she could never have, that she was loving what remained fundamentally unattainable, and the season's transformation into dying beauty seemed an appropriate metaphor for the bittersweet ache that filled her chest each time she saw him, each time they spoke, each time his hand brushed hers in passing, and she felt the shock of that contact reverberate through her entire body. The garden party at Lady Morrison's estate unfolded beneath a sky of crystalline October blue, the autumn air crisp and golden as guests wandered through the manicured grounds, admiring the late-blooming roses and the ornamental fountains that sparkled in the afternoon light, and Eleanor had accompanied the Duchess with spirits lighter than they had been in years, wearing a gown of deep amber silk that Catherine had insisted brought out the warmth in her hazel eyes, feeling for the first time in months as though perhaps happiness might be possible. Perhaps the future held something beyond mere survival. She had been standing near the reflecting pool, contemplating the way the water mirrored the changing leaves overhead, when the voices of two society matrons drifted toward her from behind a carefully trimmed hedge, their words carrying with the particular clarity that comes from speakers who do not realize they are overheard. And Lady Thornbury was saying with satisfied certainty, "Of course the betrothal will be announced before the month's end. My dear Lady Arabella Sinclair is the perfect choice. Impeccable lineage on both sides, a fortune of £30,000, and connections to half the peerage. Exactly the sort of match the Duke requires for a man in his position." And Lady Fairfax replied with agreement. "Indeed, I am surprised he has delayed this long, for everyone has known since last season that Arabella was being groomed for the position. Her mother has been quite strategic about it, and the Duke has been seen in her company at several recent functions, and you know he does nothing without careful calculation." Eleanor felt the words strike her chest like physical blows, felt the garden tilt and blur around her as the confirmation of her deepest fears materialized in those casually cruel sentences. And though some part of her had always known this inevitable truth, had reminded herself repeatedly that a duke could not marry a woman of no fortune or consequence, hearing it stated so boldly, so certainly, as established fact rather than fearful speculation, transformed abstract knowledge into devastating reality. She moved away from the reflecting pool on legs that felt unsteady, seeking some private corner where she might collect herself before tears betrayed her in public, and her mind worked with the cold clarity that comes in moments of profound loss, calculating what must be done, how she must protect herself from further pain. And by the time she returned to Rothwell House that evening, she had made her decision with the same grim determination that had carried her through her parents' death and the loss of her home. She found the Duchess in the drawing room before dinner and said with careful composure, "Catherine, I must speak with you about my situation. I have received a letter from the Countess of Albemarle offering me a position as her companion at her estate in Scotland, a generous arrangement that includes comfortable quarters and a respectable salary, and I believe I should accept it, for I cannot impose upon your hospitality indefinitely, and this represents an honorable independence." And though her voice remained steady, her hands trembled slightly as she clutched the letter that had indeed arrived 3 days prior, and which she had initially dismissed as unnecessary. The Duchess's expression shifted from surprise to something that looked remarkably like knowing sympathy, and she studied Eleanor's face with eyes that seemed to see far too much before she said gently, "Eleanor, are you quite certain this is what you wish? Scotland is very far away, and I had hoped, that is, I have enjoyed your company immensely and had thought perhaps—" But Eleanor interrupted with perhaps more force than courtesy allowed. "I am grateful beyond measure for everything you have done for me, Catherine, truly, but I cannot remain here indefinitely, living on charity, however kindly meant. And this position offers me independence and purpose, and I believe it is time I established a life of my own rather than existing in this temporary limbo." And she knew her words were too vehement, knew they revealed more than she intended, but she could not contain the desperate need to escape before her heart broke entirely beyond repair. Catherine regarded her for a long moment with an expression of gentle understanding that made Eleanor want to weep, and then the Duchess moved to her writing desk and said quietly, "If that is truly your decision, I will not attempt to dissuade you, but you must allow me at least a few days to ensure proper arrangements for your journey." And then she drew out a sheet of paper and began composing what Eleanor recognized with a sinking mixture of dread and helpless hope as an urgent note, and she watched as Catherine sealed it and rang for a footman with instructions to deliver it immediately to the Duke of Greystone's residence. And Eleanor knew with absolute certainty that the careful structure of detachment she had been building around her heart was about to be tested beyond endurance. The Duke of Greystone arrived at Rothwell House with an unprecedented lack of ceremony, less than 2 hours after Catherine's note was dispatched. His sudden appearance in the drawing-room doorway, still dressed in riding clothes, suggesting he had come directly from wherever her message had found him, without pausing even to change, and Eleanor felt her carefully constructed composure fracture at the sight of him, at the unusual disarray of his dark hair and the intensity burning in his grey eyes that she had never witnessed before. despite all their careful conversations and measured encounters. Catherine rose with diplomatic grace and said, "Alexander, how good of you to call. Miss Hartley and I were just discussing her plans for the future, and I thought perhaps you might wish to be consulted given your role in establishing her current position." And though the words were innocuous enough, Eleanor heard the deliberate emphasis and the suggestion of meanings beneath the surface, and the Duke's gaze fixed on Eleanor with an expression that made her breath catch as he replied, "Indeed, I would very much wish to discuss Miss Hartley's plans if she would grant me the courtesy of a private audience." And the formality of his words contrasted strangely with the barely controlled emotion she detected beneath them. Catherine glanced between them with what appeared to be knowing satisfaction before settling herself in a chair near the far window with her embroidery, positioned to serve as chaperone while providing the illusion of privacy, and Eleanor found herself standing as the Duke crossed the room toward her, with strides that suggested he was containing himself only through considerable effort, and when he spoke, his voice was lower than usual, roughened by something she could not quite identify. "My sister informs me that you intend to accept a position in Scotland," he began, and Eleanor detected the slight tremor beneath his controlled tone. "And I must tell you, Miss Hartley Eleanor, that I find this intelligence profoundly disturbing, for it suggests either that I have been far more opaque in my intentions than I believed possible, or that you have deliberately chosen to ignore what I had hoped was becoming increasingly evident to you over these past weeks." Eleanor felt tears threatening despite her determination to maintain dignity, and replied with a voice that wavered despite her best efforts, "Your Grace, I do not understand. I am merely accepting an honorable position that offers me independence rather than continuing to impose upon your sister's charity. Surely you cannot find fault with such a practical decision." But even as she spoke, she felt the protective wall she had built around her heart beginning to crumble, and the Duke made a sound halfway between frustration and something that sounded remarkably like desperation. "Fault?" he repeated, and she watched as his careful control began visibly fracturing, his formal bearing giving way to genuine, unguarded emotion in a transformation that seemed to cost him considerable effort. "Eleanor, I have been attempting these past weeks to demonstrate through every means available within the bounds of propriety that my regard for you has progressed far beyond the concern I might feel for any woman unjustly maligned, that my intervention at the Ashworth ball was not motivated by abstract justice, but by the fact that I had been watching you all that season, even before that terrible evening, drawn to your quiet dignity and intelligence in a way that has consumed increasingly more of my thoughts and feelings than I believed myself capable of experiencing." He took a step closer, near enough now that she could see the rapid pulse at his throat, the flush across his cheekbones, the way his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides as though he fought the impulse to reach for her, and his words tumbled forth with an urgency that bore no resemblance to his usual measured speech. "I had thought myself beyond such feelings. I believed that my position and responsibilities precluded the sort of passionate attachment I witnessed in others. But from the first time I observed you at Lady Morrison's musicale last spring, standing apart from the frivolous conversations surrounding you with a book of Wordsworth's poetry and an expression of such thoughtful melancholy, I found myself unable to look away, and when I learned of your circumstances, your loss and your courage in facing an uncertain future, I admired you, and when Wellesley dared to assault your honor, I intervened not from duty but from a possessive fury that surprised even myself." Eleanor stared at him in stunned disbelief, her mind struggling to reconcile his confession with everything she had believed about their respective positions, about the impossibility of her hopes, and she whispered, "But Lady Arabella Sinclair, I heard them say you were expected to announce your betrothal, that she was the appropriate choice for a man of your consequence, and I am nothing, no one, with neither fortune nor connections to recommend me." And something in her voice must have conveyed her pain, because the Duke finally did reach for her, his hands closing around hers with a warmth that sent shockwaves through her entire body, as he said with fierce intensity, "I care nothing for Lady Arabella Sinclair or what society expects or deems appropriate. I want a partner, Eleanor, someone who understands and shares my commitment to meaningful work, who challenges my thinking and expands my perspectives, who sees me as Alexander rather than merely the Duke of Greystone, and I have found that person in you, and the thought of you disappearing to Scotland, of never again engaging in our discussions, or seeing your face across a room, or hearing your laugh when I manage to say something that strikes you as amusing, that thought is unendurable to me." Eleanor felt the world narrow to just the two of them, standing in the drawing room with his hands warm around hers, and his confession still reverberating through her mind, reshaping everything she had believed about their interactions and her place in his thoughts. And she heard herself whisper with a trembling voice that barely rose above a breath, "Alexander, I cannot believe I thought myself foolish for hoping, thought my feelings were the height of presumption given the distance between our stations. But I have admired you from that very first evening, when you stepped forward in the ballroom and offered me your protection, though I was nothing to you. And in the weeks since I have found myself watching for you at every gathering, treasuring every conversation, every small gesture of attention, falling helplessly into affection and then into something far deeper despite knowing it was impossible, despite trying to guard my heart against the inevitable pain." And tears slipped down her cheeks as years of contained loneliness and recent hope and devastating fear finally broke through her careful composure. The Duke released one of her hands, only to reach up and gently brush away her tears with his thumb, his touch infinitely careful, as though she was something precious and fragile. And he said with a rough tenderness that made her heart ache, "Nothing about you is nothing to me. Eleanor, you are everything I did not know I needed, everything I had convinced myself I could live without, until I encountered you and realized what barren existence I had been accepting as sufficient." And then, before she could fully process his words, he was lowering himself to one knee before her, in a gesture so unexpected and so symbolically powerful that she gasped and tried to protest that he should not abase his rank in such a manner, but he silenced her with a look of such intensity that words died in her throat. "Miss Eleanor Hartley," he began with formal precision that contrasted beautifully with the emotion visible in his face, "I am asking you not as the Duke of Greystone seeking an advantageous political alliance, but as Alexander Whitmore, a man who has discovered that intellect without companionship is lonely, that purpose without partnership is hollow, and that duty without love is merely existence rather than life. I am asking if you would consent to be my wife, not to serve as an ornament to my consequence, but to be my true partner in all things, to collaborate with me on the reform work that consumes so much of my energy, to challenge my assumptions and expand my understanding, to share not just my name and position, but my thoughts and hopes and the daily texture of my life, to see me as I am rather than what my title represents, and to allow me the extraordinary privilege of loving you as you deserve to be loved." Eleanor could barely see him through her tears as she pulled him to his feet, with surprising strength born of emotion, and said in a voice that shook with joy and disbelief and overwhelming tenderness, "Yes, Alexander, yes to all of it. Yes to partnership and collaboration and seeing each other truly. Yes to building a life together that honors both duty and affection, and yes to everything you offer and everything I can give in return." And then his hands were framing her face with exquisite gentleness, and he was lowering his mouth to hers in a kiss that began tentatively, almost reverently, as though he feared she might vanish or withdraw. But when she responded by rising onto her toes and winding her arms around his neck, the kiss deepened into something that spoke of passion too long contained, and futures suddenly possible, and the profound relief of finally allowing their true feelings acknowledgement. From across the room came a delighted laugh, and the sound of applause as Catherine abandoned all pretense of not watching, and declared with satisfaction, "Well, it is about time you two stopped being so impossibly noble and cautious about your feelings. I have been waiting weeks for Alexander to overcome his conviction that his regard was somehow an imposition on you, Eleanor dear, and I am absolutely delighted to welcome you as my sister." And Eleanor broke the kiss to laugh through her tears as Alexander kept his arms firmly around her waist and replied to his sister with unusual lightness, "Your patience and scheming are both noted and appreciated, Catherine, though I would point out that I managed this proposal entirely without your assistance," which prompted Catherine to observe archly that her urgent note had certainly accelerated his timeline, and Eleanor felt the last shadows of despair and fear dissolve in the warmth of their affection, and the solid reality of Alexander's embrace, and the stunning reversal that had transformed her intended flight to Scotland into the promise of a future more beautiful than anything she had dared imagine. 3 years had passed since that evening in Catherine's drawing room. 3 years that had transformed Eleanor's life so completely that sometimes when she woke in the master suite at Greystone Estate, with spring sunlight filtering through the curtains and Alexander's breathing steady beside her, she had to remind herself that this was real, that she truly was the Duchess of Greystone, and that the desperate, ruined woman who had prepared to flee to Scotland existed now only in memory as a testament to how thoroughly life could pivot in unexpected directions. This particular morning found her in the estate office that she and Alexander had converted into a shared workspace, surrounded by architectural drawings and correspondence regarding the tenant housing improvements they had been planning for months. And she was so absorbed in reviewing the specifications for the new cottage designs that she did not hear Alexander enter until his hand settled warm and familiar on her shoulder, and he leaned down to examine the notes she had been making in the margins of the builder's proposal. "You have caught the drainage issue I missed," he said with the mixture of admiration and pleasure that still made her heart quicken even after 3 years of marriage, and she tilted her head back to look up at him as she replied with deliberate lightness, "Well, someone must attend to practical details while you concern yourself with parliamentary reform and the theoretical aspects of agricultural improvement," which earned her the smile that transformed his usually reserved expression into something boyish and unguarded, the smile he showed only to her and to their children. Their children, Thomas, named for Alexander's father, who was 2 years old and currently napping upstairs under the watchful eye of his devoted nurse, and baby Catherine, just 6 months old and sleeping in the nursery. Both of them healthy and cherished, and representing futures that Eleanor could not have imagined during those dark days of her first season. She turned back to the drawings as Alexander pulled up a chair beside her rather than retreating to his own desk, his thigh pressing against hers in casual intimacy as he reached across to point out a modification to the window placement, and they worked in comfortable silence for a while, passing documents back and forth and occasionally murmuring observations or suggestions, and the partnership they had promised each other that evening in London fully realized in these quiet moments of shared purpose and mutual respect. When the clock struck 5, Alexander set down his pen and declared that they had accomplished enough for one day and that the evening was too beautiful to spend indoors, and Eleanor allowed him to pull her to her feet and lead her outside into the gardens that she had spent the past 2 years redesigning, transforming the formal Georgian plantings into something softer and more natural, with winding paths through flowering shrubs and a small pond that attracted swans and reflected the sky. They walked with his arm around her waist and her head resting against his shoulder, moving slowly through the lengthening shadows as the spring air carried the scent of apple blossoms and newly turned earth, and Eleanor thought about that night at the Ashworth ball, about standing alone and ruined in the center of that glittering ballroom with her future collapsed around her, about the terror and despair that had seemed absolute and permanent, and about how Alexander had stepped forward and changed everything with one offered hand, one waltz, one declaration that had protected her from destruction and eventually led them both to this quiet contentment. "What are you thinking?" Alexander asked, and Eleanor smiled against his shoulder and replied honestly, "I was thinking about how impossible this would have seemed 3 years ago. How, if someone had told me that night at the ball that I would end up here, as your wife, working beside you and raising our children and walking through gardens I designed, I would have thought them mad." And she felt his arm tighten around her as he pressed a kiss to the top of her head and said quietly, "I was thinking something similar, that the worst night of your life became the catalyst for the best years of mine, and that I will be grateful until my last breath that I found the courage to step forward when you needed someone to see your worth."